Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 4 traps to avoid when reviewing cards. Now, you might be telling yourself, wait a minute, I don't review cards. I'm not a content creator. I don't have a YouTube channel. I don't review cards, Regis. Why do I need to hear this? Well, first off, a lot of people do review cards on YouTube, in comments, on Reddit. They participate in the community, and that's a great behavior to have. I would encourage everybody to talk about cards, discuss them, and review them as much as possible so that we all get a better sense of everyone's perspective and understand why some people think cards are good and why others don't. Reviewing cards is fun and a healthy activity. Yeah, sometimes we get it totally wrong. Sometimes we get it surprisingly right. But without those opinions, we never really know what to make of cards. So that discussion, both from content creators such as myself, but also from community members like you guys, really helps shape the perspective and the direction the meta takes, particularly early on in an expansion's lifespan as people are trying to figure out what cards are good. So if you're not actively reviewing cards in the community, first off, I would encourage you to do so. But I would argue that you're still reviewing cards. Each and every one of us, when we see a new card, has that gut reaction, that question in our heads, is this going to be good? What makes this powerful? What decks does this fit into? How is this card going to work? This thing's overpowered. This thing's broken. This thing's awful. We all react that way, and frankly, as we build decks in our everyday Hearthstone experience, each of us are reviewing cards. Maybe not vocally, maybe not in written word or in content like this, but you're sitting down and you're thinking, man, should I add Ragnaros to this deck? Should I try to squeeze in a Baron Geddon? Is this card better than this card? We each have these little micro reviews that we process just as a regular Hearthstone player when we're building and considering decks, thinking about tech substitutions. So this discussion isn't just to help you review cards from a new expansion set, but really just to review cards and how they're going to fit into your decks and how they might influence your play, both personally and as a part of the decks that you find on the internet and NetDeck as well. So there are actually some traps that a lot of us fall into, including myself, when both reviewing new cards but also just reviewing cards for consideration in our decks. And I've identified some of those and I wanted to talk through them today. So the first trap that a lot of us fall into, I actually don't think this one's a big problem for me, but I see a lot of people doing it online, and that is just dreaming too big. So in other words, we see a card that seems to have a really powerful effect, and we only focus on specifically like the best, biggest, highest value outcomes. So we go right to the top. We say, man, imagine if this card could do this crazy specific thing. That's going to be so good. But what happens is we forget to think about all the other instances where the card is probably just average, or perhaps the card is actually just terrible, and we don't really weigh the downsides. We get focused too much on that one amazing thing. And I wanted to include some examples, particularly from the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan set, because that's the one I'm reviewing right now and I've seen a lot of discussion on lately. So for instance, with Raza the Chained, the new Priest Legendary, when this first hit, I saw so many people talking about all the crazy Inspire kind of combos you could pull off with Raza the Chained. Like the first 10 Reddit comments I read were something like, oh my gosh, imagine this with Koldara Drake and infinite hero powers. You could just ping your opponent's health down 30 straight pings if you had the mage hero power and a Koldara Drake, and you somehow were able to play Raza the Chained. Yeah, you could do that. Like, that's a cool combo. Undeniably, that would be awesome, but that's the kind of thing that happens once in a lifetime. And probably requires a lot of effort and setup to pull off. And other people are saying, man, imagine getting the Warrior Hero power and Justicar Trueheart and using it and just getting crazy, crazy armor every turn. That's another instance where you dream really, really big. But all of those discussions, all those crazy things that can happen with Raza the Chained require a lot of pieces to fall into place and a lot of setup and a lot of time to happen. Those are not the average outcomes for this card. Nobody's thinking about the times that you're just getting ran over by your opponent and you play Raza the Chained and he gets you 1 extra hero power. So in other words, he's a 5-mana 5/5, heal 2, and then you're dead the next turn. So there are obviously instances where this card has a lot of weaknesses as well because it's rather slow and it requires time to really get tons of value. So we forget to consider the average to low outcomes for cards. So don't always focus on living the dream, the crazy, the trolled-in plays, etc., etc. Think about the card in all kinds of different situations and how the card can fail and let you down, and the problems of the card as well. If we only focus on the good, we're really missing the full picture of a card. So let's move on to the next trap to avoid when reviewing cards, and that is not considering the context of the card. Now, that might be a little confusing as a phrase at first, but what I mean when I say the context of a card are actually a few different things. So essentially, what is the cost of the card? Say it's a 2 or 3 mana card. In other words, does that class right now have better options at the 2 mana slot? How will this fit with other cards around the 2 mana slot? Does the 1 mana card lead into the 2 mana card, which leads into the 3 mana card? Does the 3 mana card leave the 2 mana card hanging out there on its own? There are just a lot of different ways to consider what world a card lives in from a curve standpoint, from a value standpoint, what decks it fits into. There are so many different things to think about when considering the card. So for instance, the example I have here is another priest card actually. This time it's the Mana Geode. This is the new 2 mana 2/3. Whenever specifically this minion is healed, summon a 2/2 crystal. So if you look at this card on its own without considering any context, it actually sounds really, really good. It's the kind of card that has infinite value. You can just get 2/2s forever. So you basically turn your hero power into a 2/2 machine that just generates 2/2s for you, right? That sounds really, really cool. But when you consider the context of Mana Geode, I've seen so many people missing this. So many people are talking about how amazing this card is. Priest finally got a good 2-drop. It's so, so strong. But think about the world this card would live in with Priest, right? You play this on turn 2, what's going to happen most of the time? It's going to die to Fiery War Axe. It's going to die to Lightning Bolt. It's going to die to a Tunnel Trog trade. It's going to die to Frostbolt. 99% of the time you play this on turn 2, this card is just going to die. So in other words, this is a River Crocolisk for a majority of the instances in which you play this card. Yes, of course, there are some late game implications. Yeah, Priest has access to buffs, but is a Power Word Shield on Mana Geode that much better than a Power Word Shield on another card that could do something else instead? Yeah, Priest has a new 3-drop, which gives cards health as well. But is this going to live that long? And frankly, are you going to have the opportunity to hero power on turn 3 immediately playing this card? Is there going to be a minion out there that you can trade into effectively? How does this line up against Totem Golem? Those are all questions in the meta right now when you consider the context that to me makes this card seem much, much worse. So yeah, considering it just on its own without any other things, it looks good. It looks fundamentally strong. It does something cool. It's a Priest 2-drop. But in the world of Hearthstone, when you start to think about actual plays and what's going to happen when you play this card, when that context is considered, this card feels a lot weaker to me. So you really have to bear down and focus on how is this card going to impact the game immediately when I play it in a real world environment. So against the most popular decks, in the curve of my list. All of those different kinds of contexts really impact how you think about a card and frankly how good it's going to be. So yeah, the internet exploded about Mana Geode. I suspect it's actually going to be experimented a ton at first and then fall out of favor pretty quickly when people realize it always just dies for free and it's basically a River Crocolisk. But again, hopefully I'm wrong. So let's move on to the next one. And this one is in many ways similar to number 2 in that being in a deck vacuum. In other words, when you review a card, you don't think about the deck that it fits into. So some cards, again, look great on their own in a vacuum. They just sound fantastic. Like, wow, that does something really cool, or there's a ton of value, or that's super efficient. All of it sounds great, but when you actually consider what deck am I going to run this in? What cards fit with this card? Does it fit a deck archetype for that class that's popular right now? as you consider those questions, you realize, oh, this thing is actually a little awkward. It doesn't really fit at all. It doesn't make sense. It falls between two archetypes. There's no option for me to really run this card in a good deck. So an example I found for this one is Pilfered Power. This is the 3-mana Druid spell. It allows you to gain an empty mana crystal for each friendly minion. That sounds insane. Druids love ramp. They like accelerating their mana as quickly as possible. So a card like Pilfered Power, it's like, man, if I have 3 minions out, this is like 3 Wild Growths for 3 mana. That's stupid good. That's like 3 times better than Wild Growth. I can't believe it. Man, I'll be at 6 mana so early in the game or whatever. Or 7 mana, actually, so early in the game. That sounds awesome. And I agree. That as a base card, as a fundamental effect, just seems absolutely overpowered and incredible. But you have to ask yourself, what deck does Pilfered Power fit into? It seems to reward really, really aggressive decks that load up the board really quickly. So you get like, a couple Living Roots, maybe in a Raven. You get, 4 or 5 Beasts out on the board perhaps, or just really cheap minions. And then you run a Pilfered Power, and suddenly you have like 8 mana on turn 4. Which, that's awesome, but if your deck is built around loading up the board with really cheap minions, guess what? You're going to draw 1 card and it's going to be a Living Roots. So you're not going to be able to spend that 8 mana. You're just going to have emptiness. You could run a lot of card draw to try to overcome that, but then what if your hand gets filled up with late game card draw in the early game and your Pilfered Power is wasted because you don't have any minions? So the very design of this card encourages deck inconsistencies and draw problems, and it's basically split between a deck that wants to run really big late game stuff and a deck that wants to run early game minions. And inconsistent decks with broken curves like that just don't work. So do you run this in a late game deck with really late game minions and Ragnaroses and Cenariuses and all the big stuff? Well, you could, but then it's going to be worse than Wild Growth because you may not have a minion on turn 2 or on turn 3. So again, at a base level, Pilfered Power sounds incredible. But what deck does it fit into? Doesn't seem to work in any of the ways that we understand Druid right now, and introduces a lot of inconsistencies in its very design. So if you look at this card in a deck vacuum, in other words, without considering any of the decks at all, it's good. When you start to figure out where this card lives, what decks does it fit into, you might just realize it's actually maybe kind of bad. So you can't live in a deck vacuum when reviewing cards. And then the final trap to avoid, I think, when reviewing cards, and this might be the biggest culprit of them all. I think dreaming too big is pretty problematic, but I have a lot of issues with this one as well, and that is overvaluing value. And that sounds kind of cute, but essentially when I'm talking about this, I'm drawing a comparison between two things, which is tempo versus value. When we're reviewing cards and you look at effects, it's very easy to say to yourself, wow, that does something so big or so cool, or that has so much value built into it. How can this card not be good? It just looks so powerful. But the problem, of course, that we all forget, myself included, is that cards take time to make an impact. Particularly, value itself is usually rather slow by definition. And we forget that tempo in Hearthstone is incredibly important. In other words, how quickly you spend your mana, how quickly you get out onto the board is really the most defining aspect of successful Hearthstone decks. So when you look at a card, for instance, like Don Honcho, the tri-class legendary for the Grimy Goons, you see him and you say, man, that's so much value. What a giant buff this card gives you. It's also got a pretty solid stat body as well. This card is just, it's great. You can do some cool stuff. You can give a minion such a big, how can my opponent answer an 11/11 Tyrion? That's so much value. And frankly, there's a lot of cards. Don Honcho might not even be the best example in this particular set. There's so many value cards in Mean Streets of Gadgetzan so far. But the problem with Don Honcho is it takes time for that 5/5 to come out there. This is already a slow card at 7 mana, But when you play him, that 5/5 buff hits something in your hand, which presumably you won't be able to play right away. So you'll have to spend even more mana next turn to get that 5/5 buff. And guess what? There's a good chance that the minion you buffed won't be able to attack right away either, or won't have taunt to force action through it. So it might be yet another turn before you're actually able to utilize that 5/5 buff. So Don Honcho is basically a 5/6 for 3 turns. Yes, eventually there's going to be a lot of value, but you sacrifice so much tempo in achieving that value that I'm worried this card actually won't be very good. I think it's going to be just too slow, and it won't force your opponent's hand enough or swing the board instantly enough that they won't just run over you and win the game anyway, because they'll just be able to deal with your 5/6 and keep on moving, and you'll be stuck waiting for this value to enact itself. So too often we look at value, we look at all the big flashy stuff, and we forget that the actual speed and how instant these effects happen is probably more important often than the total value they pay off. Because really, Hearthstone is not a control style game. It's got a nice balance and range of archetypes. There's a lot of faster decks that are successful, and especially the way the ladder works, it encourages faster decks because you want your games to be faster, to give you more time to climb and more opportunity to succeed, to climb up the ladder faster, because there's just a limited time frame in which to rank up. So people tend to bias towards faster decks, and sometimes control decks just get overran, and nobody likes playing 40-minute games on the ladder. Then you still only win 60% of your games. You'd rather play a 5-minute game than a 40-minute game. So these value cards look good at first glance when you're seeing new expansions, but as you realize in practice, when you have to bear down and play a 45-minute fatigue game to really make them work and succeed, they tend to fall out of favor pretty quickly after an expansion is released, because tempo and aggression rise back to the top, and value is often forgotten. So be careful not to overvalue the value of a card. And that's not just true in reviews, but also when you're building your decks. Don't always be so greedy. Sometimes you have to get a nice curve and some early cards just to make things work and make your deck balanced. So those are my 4 traps to avoid when reviewing cards, when considering cards to add to your decks. Don't dream too big. Don't forget to consider the context of a card. Think about the actual decks a card fits into, so don't just look at it in a vacuum. And then finally, don't focus too much on value. You do have to pay some attention to the speed or tempo of a card, and particularly a deck as well. So that's going to wrap it up for my look at the 4 traps to avoid. I'm curious what you guys think about reviewing cards. As someone who reviews cards, I'm curious if you think I miss anything in particular, or if I bias my opinions one way or another too much. I think I do a good job, and I try my very best to be objective and consider all the angles, but if there's anything I'm missing or not seeing pretty regularly, let me know. That's going to make me better. It'll also help all of us just think about how to value and consider cards, which is always helpful. If you have any other questions, let me know. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.